The world dissolved into screaming horses and splintering wood. The crack of the rifle shot was still ringing in her ears when the stagecoach lurched, tilted, and then surrendered to gravity, tumbling down the rocky embankment. Charlotte was thrown from the window, her body slamming against the frozen earth before the coach itself shattered against a stand of pine. She tasted blood. Her shoulder throbbed where the door had clipped her, and the icy air burned her lungs. Around her, men were shouting, their voices sharp and cruel in the thin mountain air. Another shot echoed. Survival was not a thought. It was an instinct, raw and absolute. She scrambled away from the wreckage, clutching the thin leather satchel to her chest. Her feet, shod in uselessly thin city boots, punched through the crust of the snow, sinking her to her knees. She ignored the pain, ignored the tearing cold, and clawed her way up the opposite embankment and into the thick timber. She ran until the shouting faded, until the only sound was the shriek of the wind through the high passes of the Wyoming Territory and the desperate, ragged sawing of her own breath. Hours passed. The sun, a weak watercolor smear in the gray sky, began to dip, stealing the last of the day's meager warmth. Her dress, stained with mud and a darker, terrifying crimson from a gash on her temple, was freezing solid. Her hands, bare and raw, had long since stopped feeling the cold. They were just numb, useless weights, locked in a claw grip around the satchel's handle. Inside it was all she had left, a heavy naval revolver she barely knew how to use, and a small, tin-framed photograph of a laughing child. The terrain was unforgiving. She was not made for this. She was made for parlors, for tea, for hiding bruises beneath silk. But the woman she had been was dead, left behind in a pool of blood on a polished floor miles and miles away. Only this animal remained, pushing forward, one agonizing step at a time. She stumbled over a snowy ridgeline, her vision tunneling. The wind here was a physical blow, threatening to peel her from the mountain. Below, in a small, sheltered bowl of land, a thin curl of wood smoke rose against the deepening twilight. A cabin? It was miles from any settlement, miles from anything. It was salvation, or it was another trap. At this point, she had no choice. She half fell, half slid down the incline. Every step was a prayer and a curse. The cabin grew closer, a dark, squat shape of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. It looked as cold and hostile as the mountains themselves. She reached the door, a single plank of heavy wood, and raised a hand to knock. Her fist felt like stone, heavy and disconnected from her arm. She beat it against the wood twice before her legs gave out, her strength finally spent. She collapsed against the door frame just as the latch scraped from within. The door opened. The man who stood there was tall, silhouetted against the meager light of a hearth. He filled the entire frame, a wall of worn wool and suspicion. Eli McKenna watched the woman crumple onto his doorstep. He had seen her coming for the last 10 minutes, a dark speck struggling across the ridge, moving like a wounded deer. He had reached for his rifle, kept by the door, and waited. He did not get visitors. Visitors were trouble. This one looked like the sum of all troubles. She was young, maybe 21, 22. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was matted with snow and dried blood. Her clothes were fine, or had been, but were now ruined. She was clutching a satchel like it held gold bullion. He looked past her, scanning the snow-blown landscape. No one else, no posse, no husband, just her. She tried to push herself up, her eyes wide with a frantic, cornered terror. "Please," she whispered, the sound broken. Eli said nothing. He stared at her for a long, cold moment, his face carved from the same hard granite as the mountains. Then, with a sigh that was more irritation than pity, he bent down. He hooked one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She weighed almost nothing, and lifted her. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the howling wind. He laid her on the dirt floor near the stone hearth, Not gently, but not roughly. He did not lay her on his bed. That was his. For a moment, she slipped into darkness. When her eyes fluttered open, the man was kneeling beside her, his expression unchanged. He had taken her satchel and set it on the table, just out of her reach. "Your hands," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel sifted through rust. She looked. They were white and waxy, the skin pulled tight. Frostbite. Without another word, he stood, went outside, and returned with 2 buckets of snow. He began packing the snow firmly around her hands and stockinged feet, ignoring her sharp intake of breath as the frozen mass began to draw the deeper, more dangerous frost from her skin. The process was agonizing, a slow burn that felt like fire, but it was better than the dead numbness. He worked in absolute silence. The cabin was small, barely 1 room, a rough-nailed table, 2 chairs, a cold pantry, and the hearth, and the bed. It was a simple rope cot with a thick mattress stuffed with what looked like corn husks, covered in a mound of heavy wool blankets and worn buffalo hides. It took up a quarter of the room. He saw the gash on her temple and wiped at it with a rag dipped in whiskey from a tin cup. She flinched, hissing as the alcohol stung. He paid her reaction no mind. His gaze lingered on the dark, spreading bruises on her throat, fingerprints left by a heavy hand. He noted the way she cradled her ribs, the blood on her dress that clearly was not all from her temple. He had seen violence. He knew its shape. He finished his work and tossed the rag onto the table. He picked up her satchel, unlatched it, and looked inside. He saw the revolver first. He took it out, checked the load, and placed it on the high mantel, far from her. Then he saw the photograph. He glanced at it, his expression hardening slightly, before latching the bag and dropping it back by her side. He stood, looming over her. "I don't care who you are," Eli McKenna said, his voice low, "and I don't much care what you did, but this is my home. You bring trouble here. You answer to me, and you don't lie. You lie to me. I'll put you back out in that snow myself." Charlotte could only nod, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they might break. He gave her a tin mug of hot, thin broth. It tasted of salt and wild onion, and it was the best thing she had ever known. She drank it, her hands shaking so badly he had to steady the cup. When she was done, he took the cup, banked the fire for the night, and turned to his bed. The temperature in the cabin, already cold, began to plummet. The hearth gave off a dull red glow, but it could not fight the Wyoming winter pressing in through the logs. Charlotte pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, trying to conserve every flicker of warmth. The floor was packed earth, frozen solid. The cold seeped through her wet clothes, into her bones. Eli stripped off his heavy coat and boots. He sat on the edge of the bed, his back to her, and pulled his shirt off. Charlotte looked away, her face burning, though the rest of her was freezing. His back, visible in the dim firelight, was a road map of old scars. White lines, puckered and smooth, crisscrossed his skin. He climbed under the blankets and settled. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind and the uncontrollable tremor of her shivering. He waited. 10 minutes, 15. Her shivers were becoming violent, audible. "You're a fool," he growled into the darkness. She said nothing, clamping her jaw shut. He let out another impatient sigh. "The floor will kill you by morning. The cold will take your feet, then your lungs. You'll be dead before the sun is up." I will be fine," she chattered, a useless lie. "I told you not to lie to me." He threw back the heavy buffalo hide. The sound was loud in the small room. "Get in the bed." Charlotte froze. This was it. This was the price of shelter. The same price demanded by other men, in other rooms. "No," she whispered. "This ain't a request," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "I won't have a corpse on my floor come morning. It's a waste of a burial." He paused. "You want to live? You sleep in the bed. but don't mistake it for kindness. It's just practicality." She stared at his dark shape. He had not moved toward her. He was waiting. The cold was a predator, and it was closing in. She knew, with chilling certainty, that he was right. Slowly, painfully, she got to her feet. Her body screamed in protest. She felt lightheaded, dizzy with cold and fear. She walked the few steps to the bed. "On top of the blankets," he ordered. "Your clothes are damp." She did as she was told, lying stiffly on the rough wool, as far to the edge of the narrow cot as she could get. Eli reached over and pulled the heavy, smoky-smelling buffalo hide over her, tucking it in tight. "Lie still," he commanded. "Your shivering wastes heat." He turned his back to her. The bed was tense. It was cold. She could feel the hard ridge of his spine through the blankets separating them. He was a mountain of a man, solid and unmoving. She lay rigid, her back to his, every muscle coiled. She did not dare breathe too deeply, terrified any small movement might be misinterpreted. They lay like that for hours, two strangers bound by a snowstorm and a shared bed, separated by a few inches of wool and a mile of distrust. The cabin was so quiet she could hear the faint whisper of his breathing, slow and steady. He seemed to be asleep, but she knew he was not. She did not sleep either. She lay awake, listening to the wind try to tear the cabin from the earth, and drifted, not into sleep, but into memory. The images came in sharp, ugly flashes. The flash of firelight on a gold ring, a man's hand, heavy and large, closing around her neck, the smell of whiskey and sweet bay rum, an odor that now made her stomach heave. She heard a child crying, a thin, desperate wail from another room. She saw her own hand, holding something heavy, not the revolver, something else, the sound it made. And then the blood, so much blood, spreading across a white linen shirt, soaking into the bodice of her blue silk dress. She gasped, a small, choked sound, her body jerking on the cot. Beside her, the man's breathing did not change, but she knew. He was awake. He had heard. The sun came hours later, a knife edge of gray light at the window. The fire was nearly dead. Eli rose from the bed without a word. He moved with a quiet economy, pulling on his shirt, boots, and coat. He did not look at her. He simply went to the hearth, stirred the embers, and added new logs until a small flame caught. Charlotte sat up, stiff and sore. The night in the bed had saved her, but she felt hollowed out, exhausted. The pain in her hands and feet was a dull, angry throb. Eli went outside. She watched him through the single, ice-caked window. He walked to a chopping block near the woodpile. He was not chopping wood. He pulled a long hunting knife from the sheath on his belt and a whetstone from his pocket. He spat on the stone. Then he began to sharpen the knife. The sound was methodical, rhythmic, and terrifying. Shing, shing, shing. It cut through the morning silence. A clear and deliberate message. He tested the blade against his thumb, his gaze distant, fixed on the snowy ridgeline she had crossed. He was reminding her, he was not a soft man. He would not be fooled. He was dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than the men she was running from. He had saved her from the cold, but he might be a different kind of killer. She huddled by the fire, rubbing her raw hands. Trapped. Later that morning, as she was miserably trying to dry her dress by the fire, she heard it, the muffled sound of hoofbeats approaching, crunching in the deep snow. Her blood turned to ice. She looked at Eli, her eyes wide with panic. He put down the axe he was mending. "The pantry," he said, his voice flat. "Now, and be silent, or I'll make you silent." She scrambled into the small, dark space, pulling the curtain shut. It smelled of dried meat, potatoes, and dust. She pressed her eye to a gap in the fabric. A man on a heavy bay horse stopped 20 yards from the cabin. He wore a thick coat and a marshal's star. glinting dull silver. Eli stepped outside onto the porch, blocking the doorway. He held his rifle loosely in one hand. "Morning," the marshal called out, his voice tight from the cold. "Seen a woman pass this way. Young, dark hair. Escaped custody." Charlotte stopped breathing. This was it. He would give her up, for money, or just to be rid of the trouble. Eli stood still for a moment, letting the wind whip around him. He looked up at the ridge, then back at the marshal. "Ain't seen no one," Eli said. "Been snowed in for 3 days. Just me and the wind." The marshal spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the snow. "She's wanted for murder. Killed her husband back east. There's a reward. $500. $500. Enough to buy a new life. Enough to make a man betray anyone." Eli shrugged, unimpressed. If she came through here, the wolves got her. Nothing survives that pass in a blizzard without proper gear. The marshal seemed to consider this. He stared at the cabin, his eyes narrowed, as if trying to see through the logs. Charlotte could feel his gaze, even hidden in the dark. Eli did not move. He just waited, a pillar of indifferent stone. Finally, the marshal grunted. "Well, if you see her, you ride to Rawlins. That's good money." "If I go to Rawlins," Eli said, "it'll be for ammunition, not gossip." The marshal gave him one last hard look, then wheeled his horse around. "Much obliged." Eli watched him until he was a small dot disappearing over the rise. He stood there for another full minute before turning and coming back inside, latching the door heavily. He walked to the pantry and pulled back the curtain. Charlotte was leaning against the wall, shaking so hard she could barely stand. Her relief was so profound it was sickening. He had lied for her. He had turned away $500 for her. He looked at her, his face grim. "He'll be back," he said. "Or others will. Your face is on a poster. You brought the trouble." He turned away from her and went back to mending the axe, his message clear. He had protected his solitude, not her. But Charlotte saw it differently. He had not owed her that lie. He had taken a risk. He had stood between her and the law, and he had not flinched. For the first time since she had climbed out of that wrecked stagecoach, a small, fragile warmth, one that had nothing to do with the fire, settled in her chest. That night, the ritual repeated, the fire banked, the cabin plunging into lethal cold. "Get in," he said. It was not a question. She moved to the bed, this time with less hesitation. She was exhausted, her body aching from the fall and the frost, her mind worn raw by the marshal's visit. She lay on top of the blankets, and he covered her with a heavy hide. He turned his back to her, and she turned hers to him. The silence returned. Sleep, when it finally came, was not restful. It was a dark, swirling pit of her fears. The images returned, the hand on her throat, the smell of whiskey, the child's cry. She was running, but her feet were stuck in thick, dark mud. She whimpered, a low, animal sound of distress. Her body began to tremble, a violent, bone-rattling shake that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the terror, shaking her apart from the inside. In the darkness, Eli awoke. He lay still, listening to her ragged breathing, the choked sobs she was fighting. He knew that sound. It was the sound of the war, the sound of men who knew they were about to die, the sound of things broken beyond repair. He turned. She was rigid, her back to him, shaking as if in a fever. His first instinct was to ignore it. It was not his business. He was not her savior. He was a man hiding from his own ghosts, and he had no room for hers. But the trembling was so violent, it was the sound of a small thing breaking. He hesitated, his jaw tight, then, slowly, moved by an instinct older than suspicion. He reached out a hand. It was a large hand, calloused and rough from the axe in the cold. He laid it flat on her shoulder. A simple, heavy weight. It was not a caress. It was an anchor. Charlotte flinched, her entire body going rigid. A sharp gasp escaped her, the sound of a rabbit snared. She expected the hand to grip, to pull, to demand. But it did not. It just rested there, heavy, warm. It did not ask for anything. It simply stayed, a solid presence in the terrifying dark. She did not pull away. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. And slowly, under the steady, impartial weight of his hand, the shaking began to subside. The terror did not leave, but it quieted, beaten back by the simple, human fact of his touch. She held herself perfectly still, and for the first time in a very long time, she fell into a true, dark, and dreamless sleep. The morning light was flat and gray, reflecting the hostility of the world outside. The marshal was gone, but his presence lingered, a cold spot in the room. Charlotte sat by the fire, her hands cradled in her lap. The burning ache of the frostbite had subsided, replaced by a deep, throbbing pain. Eli was cleaning his rifle, his movements economical and precise. He pushed a greased patch through the barrel, his back to her, but she knew he was aware of her every breath. The silence stretched, amplifying the scrape of the cleaning rod against the metal. "You favor your left side," he said, his voice quiet, not turning. Charlotte stiffened. "I fell from the coach." He stopped his work. He turned his head just enough to look at her. "You fell on your ribs, but not your temple? You bruised your throat on a rock, but not your cheek." She said nothing, her gaze dropping to the fire. He set the rifle down and walked to her. He knelt, not in supplication, but for a better view, like a man assessing livestock. He was close enough that she could smell the faint, metallic scent of gun oil on his hands. "Let me see your hands," he said. She flinched, pulling them back. "It's not a request. If the black rot sets in, you'll lose them. I won't have a cripple on my hands." His practicality was more disarming than kindness. Slowly, she extended her hands. He took them in his own. His grip was surprisingly gentle, his calloused thumbs probing the swollen, discolored skin. "The skin is unbroken," he murmured, mostly to himself. "You were lucky." He continued to hold them for a moment, his gaze drifting from her hands to her face. "These aren't the hands of a farm wife. They're soft." Or they were. He released her and stood. He returned to his rifle, the interrogation seemingly over. But as he resumed cleaning, he spoke again. "The marshal said you killed your husband." Her breath hitched. She wrapped her arms around her chest, a protective gesture that only highlighted her bruised ribs. "I didn't," she whispered, her voice raw. "I didn't do what they say." "People rarely do," Eli said, squinting down the barrel. He did not ask her for the truth. He did not say he believed her. He simply accepted her words as a marker, another piece of the trouble she had brought to his door. He seemed to hold her statement, weighing it against the $500, and found the world wanting. A quiet routine began to form, born of necessity and the proximity of four walls. Charlotte could not stand the weight of her uselessness. She began to help, small things at first. She fetched firewood from the pile just outside the door, her movements stiff and painful. Eli watched her through the window the first few times, his own rifle resting on the table, but he did not stop her. She swept the packed earth floor with his rough broom. She washed their 2 tin plates and cups in a bucket of snowmelt, scrubbing them with harsh lye soap until her raw hands burned. She found his small mending kit and, with clumsy, swollen fingers, began to repair a long tear in his wool coat. Eli watched all of this with a quiet, unsettling suspicion. He was a man welded to his solitude. Her presence was a disruption, but her care was an invasion. He had not known a woman's touch in this cabin, not in all the years he had been here. He found himself surprised by her resilience. She was not as soft as her hands suggested. One afternoon, He returned from checking his trap lines, a string of rabbits over his shoulder. He moved with a stiffness that was new, his left leg dragging slightly. He dropped the rabbits by the door and sat heavily at the table, his face pale beneath his beard. Charlotte stopped her mending. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he bit out, his hand going to his thigh. "It's not nothing. You're favoring it." She put the coat down and walked to him. "Let me see." "I don't need a nursemaid," he snarled, but his voice lacked its usual force. "You saved me from the frost," she said, her voice firm, echoing his own practicality. "Let me save you from the rot." He stared at her, a long, hard look that tried to push her away. She did not waver. With a grunt of pained frustration, he relented. He gestured at his leg. "Be quick about it." She knelt. He had rolled his heavy trouser leg up, and she saw the cause. The teeth of a bear trap, old and rusted, had torn through the fabric and the flesh beneath. He must have stumbled into one of his own forgotten snares. The wound was deep, inflamed, and weeping. He had clearly tried to treat it himself, badly, and it was beginning to fester. She did not gasp or recoil. She simply stood. "I need hot water, and whiskey." He pointed to the kettle by the fire and the jug on the shelf. She moved with purpose. She tore a long, clean strip from the bottom of her petticoat, a garment she would likely never wear again. She cleaned the wound, first with the hot water, then with the stinging, antiseptic fire of the whiskey. Eli sat like stone, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He did not make a sound, but a thin sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. She worked carefully, her touch surprisingly steady. She cleaned the torn flesh, her expression focused, her fear forgotten. He found himself watching her. Not the wound. He was surprised by her care. She was not disgusted by the festering wound. She was methodical. She was not afraid of him, at least not in this moment. When she was done, she wrapped the wound tightly with the clean cloth. "You need to rest it. The cold will make it worse." She was surprised by his restraint. Throughout the entire painful process, he had not moved, not flinched away from her touch. He was all hard edges and coiled violence, the kind of man she had learned to fear above all else. Yet, since the moment she had arrived, he had not laid a hand on her with anything but that strange, dispassionate practicality. He had not demanded the price that other men would have taken for granted. He was a puzzle, a dangerous man who showed her a kind of decency she had forgotten existed. The boundary of the shared bed, once a rigid line of distrust, began to thin. The ritual remained the same. She lay on top of the blankets. He covered her with the hide. They turned their backs, but the space between them felt different. It was no longer empty. Cold territory. It was charged. One night, he shifted in his sleep, his arm brushing her back. She jolted, her whole body tensing, but the touch retreated immediately. Another night. The cold was so bitter that they lay closer, drawn by the simple, animal need for warmth. She could feel the heat radiating from his broad back. She could hear the slow, deep rhythm of his breathing, inches from her ear. It was an intimacy of necessity, but it was intimacy nonetheless. She lay awake, acutely aware of the solid, living man beside her, a man who had lied for her, and she wondered if he was as aware of her. The fragile peace shattered 2 nights later. The moon was high, casting a blade of pale, sickly light through the one window. Eli was right. The bounty hunters would be back. Or the marshal. She could not stay. She was a plague, and she was infecting his sanctuary. The $500 was a temptation, but the charge of aiding a fugitive was a hanging offense. She had to leave, for his sake. She waited until his breathing was deep and even, carefully, silent as smoke. She slipped out from under the heavy hide. The floor was so cold it felt like stepping on hot coals. Her body screamed in protest. She gathered her ruined boots, her satchel. She did not dare take the revolver from the mantel. She only took the photograph. Her hand was on the wooden latch of the door. She pulled it, and the wood scraped. A sound as loud as a cannon shot in the silent cabin. "Going somewhere?" The voice came from the darkness by the hearth. She spun, her heart leaping into her throat. He was not in the bed. He was sitting in the cabin's second chair, a dark shape in the shadows, a rifle resting across his knees. He had been waiting. She stammered, her hand still on the door. I can't stay. I can't." "You were running," he stated. "To protect you?" Her desperation made her voice sharp. "That marshal, he'll come back. They'll find me here. They'll think you helped me. They'll hang you. I have to go." He stood. He moved across the small room in 2 long, silent strides. Charlotte pressed herself back against the door, her hand flying to her mouth. He did not touch her. He slammed his open palm flat against the wood, just inches from her head. The impact shuddered through her, a contained explosion of anger that was far more terrifying than a shout. "You walk out that door," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "You're dead in an hour. The cold doesn't get you. The wolves will. And if they don't, the bounty hunters will." He leaned in, trapping her between his body and the door. She could feel the heat of his anger. "If they find you, they'll kill you. Or worse." His voice dropped even lower. "They'll take you back. And what they do to a woman wanted for murder on a long ride. You won't last a day. You think you're protecting me? You're a fool. You're committing suicide." She stared up at him, breathless, trapped by his arm, by the sheer, unmoving wall of him. He was right. She was a fool. She had been a fool her whole life. He studied her face in the moonlight, seeing the raw terror there. His anger seemed to cool, replaced by a weary frustration. He stepped back. "You want to leave?" he said, his voice returning to its normal, rough timbre. "Wait for the thaw. Wait until your hands are healed. Don't be stupid." He turned away from her and went to the hearth, kneeling to stir the embers back to life. The tension broke, leaving Charlotte shaking and weak with relief. As he added a small log to the coals, he spoke to the fire. "You have family? Anyone waiting for you?" Her hand instinctively went to her satchel, where the photograph was hidden. She stopped the movement, but not before he saw it. "No," she said. The lie was sharp, too quick. Her voice cracked on the single word, a small, fragile sound that betrayed everything. "No one." Eli heard the break in her voice. He saw the aborted gesture to the satchel. He knew it was a lie. He did not push. He simply accepted it. Another secret to add to the pile. That night, the tension in the bed was sharp as glass. They lay with their backs to each other, the space between them humming with the unspoken argument. With her lie, with his anger. Charlotte lay awake, staring at the rough log wall. He had been angry. Yes, but not for the reasons she expected. He had been angry that she would throw her life away. "Why are you here?" she whispered into the darkness. He did not move. She wasn't even sure he was awake. "This place," she pressed on, needing to fill the silence. "It's so far from everything. You're not just a trapper. You hide, just like me." His movement was sudden, violent. He rolled onto his back. "We are nothing alike." "Then why are you alone?" Silence. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, filled with things that had been buried but not laid to rest. As Eli stared up at the smoke-darkened rafters, the answer he would not give her played out in his own mind. He saw a patch of thawing earth on a hillside, a simple wooden cross driven into the mud, the name Abigail carved deep. He saw his own hands, holding the scorched, blackened frame of a daguerreotype. The woman's face inside melted into an unrecognizable swirl, and he saw the chest at the foot of his bed, the one that never opened. Inside, he knew, lay a Union officer's coat, dark blue and heavy, folded neatly, a dark, stiff stain over the breast pocket. He turned his back to her again, a sharp, definitive movement. The conversation was over. The next day, the wind changed. It stopped coming from the west and began to howl from the north, bringing with it the full, unbridled fury of the high mountains. A snowstorm descended. Not a gentle fall, but a white, screaming wall of ice and wind. The world vanished. For 4 days, the cabin was a tiny, fragile island in a sea of white oblivion. The wind shrieked, a constant, maddening sound that scraped at the nerves. The snow piled up, burying the window, pressing against the door. The daylight was reduced to a dim, gray twilight. They were trapped. The cabin became a cage. The firewood, stacked high inside, began to dwindle. Eli fought his way out once to the woodpile, returning crusted in ice, his face raw. The bear trap wound on his leg, clearly aggravated. The food, never plentiful, was reduced to half rations of dried venison and cold beans. And the cold was a living thing. It seeped through the chinking, flowed under the door. The fire was their only lifeline, and they huddled near it, feeding it stick by stick. On the third night of the storm, the temperature plummeted. The cabin was lethal. When it came time to sleep, the ritual of the bed was not enough. Charlotte lay on top of the blankets, shivering so violently she could barely breathe. Eli watched her for a long moment, his face grim in the firelight. "Stop being stupid," he growled. He didn't wait for her to move. He grabbed her by the arm and pulled her, not gently, from the top of the blankets to under them, shoving her against the rope-strung wall. "You'll freeze like that," he said. He climbed in after her, pulling the heavy buffalo hide and the wool blankets over both of them. Then he turned and pulled her back against his chest. Her body went rigid. This was not the chaste backs-to-each-other arrangement. This was flesh against flesh, her back pressed hard against the solid wall of his chest. His arm came around her, pulling her tight, his hand resting just below her ribs. "We share heat, or we freeze," he muttered, his voice rough in her ear. "Lie still." She did. She was terrified, but the heat from his body was undeniable. It was a furnace, seeping into her frozen spine, into her kidneys, spreading through her limbs. Her shivering began to slow. This was not comfort. This was survival. But as the hours passed, as the storm raged outside, it began to change. His body was a shield against the cold. His arm, heavy and possessive, was also protective. This was no longer just survival. This was a choice. He had pulled her in, and she, in her terror and cold, had melted against him. She was clinging to him. On the fourth night, the wind reached a fever pitch. It sounded like a woman screaming, a sound that drilled directly into Charlotte's soul. The isolation, the hunger, the fear, the relentless, suffocating proximity to this dangerous, quiet man. It all finally broke her. She began to cry. It was silent at first, just hot tears tracking down her temples, soaking the corn husk pillow. Then a single, hitching sob escaped her, loud in the small space. Eli, who had been lying awake, felt her body shake. He said nothing. The sob broke the dam. She turned in his arms, her movement frantic, desperate. She was facing him now. The buffalo hide pooled around them. She grabbed the front of his wool shirt, her fists clenched tight. "Don't," she whispered, the word broken. "Don't what?" His voice was low, wary. "Don't give me away!" She was sobbing openly now, her voice thick with terror and shame. "When they come back, the marshal, please, I'll go, I'll run away. Just don't you be the one, please." She was begging, dissolving. All the fight that had gotten her through the stagecoach crash, the frost, the interrogation, it was all gone. He looked down at her in the faint, dying glow of the fire. He saw the bruises on her throat, stark in the dim light. He saw the absolute, gut-churning terror of a hunted animal. He did what he had not done in years. He acted. He pulled her closer, his arm tightening. His other hand, the one that had held the knife, the rifle, the axe, came up. He cupped the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her matted hair, holding her steady. He pulled her forehead against his chest. "I won't," he said. The words were a vow, rough and absolute, spoken into her hair. "I won't." He held her as she wept, her small, broken sobs muffled against his shirt. He just held her, solid as the mountain, letting the storm inside her rage itself out. After a long time, her crying quieted. She was exhausted, empty. She was still clinging to him, her face pressed against his chest. Slowly, she tipped her head back, looking up at him. Their faces were inches apart. They were breathing the same cold air. The cabin was suffocatingly small. The world reduced to the space of this narrow bed, the loneliness that defined him, and the terror that defined her, met in the air between them. He looked at her mouth, then at her eyes. He hesitated. He saw the bruises. He knew what she was running from. He was a man full of his own ghosts, his own violence. He was not a man for this. But she was the one who moved. She needed to feel something other than fear. She needed to feel, just for 1 second, that she was wanted, not just hidden, that she was a woman, not just a fugitive. She lifted her chin, closing the last trembling inch. Her lips, chapped and cold, met his. It was a desperate, clumsy kiss. It was slow. It tasted of salt from her tears, of loneliness. It was not a kiss of passion, but of pure, unadulterated need. It was a plea. "I am alive. You are alive. We are here." Eli went stiff, surprised. But as her mouth moved against his, something deep inside him, something he had buried under years of ice and solitude, cracked. His own crushing loneliness, his own unspoken grief, rose up to meet hers. His hand moved from the back of her head to her jaw, his rough thumb brushing the tear track on her cheek. He held her face, and he kissed her back. The kiss changed. It deepened. The desperation faded, replaced by a slow, rising heat. He was kissing away the memory of the marshal. She was kissing away the ghost of her husband. He pulled her on top of him, the heavy blankets tangling around them. She gasped into his mouth, a sound of surprise, of fear, of a sudden, sharp need. This was a man's touch, but it was not the one she remembered. It was not brutal, it was hungry. It was as starved as her own. The night became emotionally raw, their unspoken grief mixed with a desperate, physical need. His hands were on her waist, pulling her flush against him, and hers were tangled in his hair, clinging to him. It was a collision, a raw and reckless claiming in the heart of the blizzard, a desperate attempt by two broken people to find a single moment of warmth, a single moment of life, in a world that had offered them nothing but death. The storm broke as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world that was dangerously bright. The sun, reflecting off the new snow, was blinding. Inside the cabin, the silence that fell was heavier and colder than the blizzard had been. Charlotte woke before he did, or at least before he moved. She lay perfectly still, her body aching, her skin hypersensitive. The memory of the night, of their desperate, starved kisses, of his body covering hers, was so vivid it was a physical weight. She felt not shame, but a raw, terrifying vulnerability. She had sought comfort and found a conflagration. Now, in the cold light of day, she had to face the ashes. When Eli finally rose, he did so with a quiet, deliberate distance. He did not look at her. He moved to the hearth, dressed in the shadows, his back a rigid wall. The man who had held her, who had whispered a promise into her hair, was gone. The recluse was back. He built the fire, his movements economical, precise, and closed. Charlotte sat up, pulling the heavy buffalo hide around her. She felt the chill of the room settle onto her bare shoulders. She regretted nothing. That brief, reckless moment had been the only warmth she had known in months. But as she watched him test the edge of his axe with his thumb, she feared she had misread the signs. She had broken their fragile, unspoken arrangement. She had taken his act of survival and twisted it into something he clearly did not want. He finally spoke, his voice rough from sleep, his gaze fixed on the fire. "The air is warmer," he said. "The thaw will come fast. That snow will melt enough to bring riders." His words were practical, a cold splash of water. He was not thinking about the night, he was thinking about the threat. He was reminding her that the world was still hunting her. He took her outside later that morning. The snow was already dripping from the pines, the sound a constant, ticking clock. The air felt clean, so clean. He retrieved her revolver from the mantel, where it had sat untouched since her arrival. He checked the load, then handed it to her. Grip first. "You don't know how to use this," he stated. It was not a question. Not really," she admitted. The weight of it in her hand was heavy, unnatural. "Then you'll learn," he said. "The next man who comes won't be a marshal. He'll be a man like Dawson, and he'll shoot first." He set a small, empty bean can on a stump 50 yards away, a dark spot against the blinding white. "That's a man's chest. Fire." She raised the gun, both hands shaking. The cold metal stung her fingers. She tried to remember what she had seen in plays, tried to aim down the short barrel. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The kickback was a violent, angry fist, slamming her wrist upward. The shot went wide, kicking up a plume of snow 10 feet to the left of the stump. "You're dead," Eli said flatly. He did not raise his voice. "You flinched. You closed your eyes. You missed by a mile. Do it again." She fired again and again. The noise battered her. The smell of sulfur filled the air. She missed every time. Frustration and fear brought hot, angry tears to her eyes. "I can't," she cried, lowering the heavy gun. "You can." He stepped toward her. He was not a patient teacher. He sighed, a sound of deep impatience, and moved behind her. "You're fighting it," he said. His voice was low, right by her ear. She tensed. His body heat a solid wall at her back. He reached around her, his left hand covering hers, forcing her fingers into the correct grip. His right hand came to her elbow, steadying her. "Stop trying to aim. Just point. Feel where the barrel is going. Breathe out. Slow." He put his hand over hers on the trigger. "Now." He squeezed her hand. The gun fired. The tin can jumped from the stump and vanished into the snow. She stared, breathless. He stepped back, breaking the contact. The cold rushed in where he had been. "Again," he commanded. She fired the last 2 shots. She missed one, but the last one hit the stump, splintering the wood. It was enough. "Reload it," he ordered, tossing her the box of cartridges from his coat. He did not stop there. He took her into the dripping timberline, the snow sucking at her boots. "Don't ever run uphill," he said, his voice quiet. "You break the skyline. You're a target for a mile. Stay low. Use the shadows." He showed her how to walk on the pine needles, heel to toe, to make no sound. He taught her how to read the crushed snow, to see where a man had passed. The woods will swallow you. If you let them, you have to be quieter than the animal you're hunting, or the one that's hunting you. They spent the day in this strange, practical ritual. He was investing in her. He was not offering her comfort, he was offering her fangs. Their bond deepened, not with soft words or gentle touches, but with the shared weight of gunpowder and the cold, hard knowledge of survival. That evening, the cabin felt different. The morning's awkwardness had been burned away by the gunfire, replaced by the quiet hum of partnership. She was cleaning the revolver, as he had shown her. the movement slow, methodical. She was learning. Eli sat across from her, sharpening his knife. The sound, shing, 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 no longer terrified her. It was the sound of preparation. "The photograph," he said, his voice quiet, not looking up from the blade. "The one in your satchel. Who's the child?" Her hand stilled on the gun. She had expected the question, dreaded it. He had taught her to shoot. He had lied for a marshal. He had buried his anger and protected her. He deserved the truth. "He's my son," she whispered, her voice thick. Eli stopped sharpening. He laid the knife and the whetstone on the table and looked at her, his gaze level. Impossible to read. "You told me you had no one." I lied. The admission was a relief. "His name is Jesse. He's 4 years old." The story, held back for so long, finally broke free. It tumbled out of her, a torrent of poison and grief. She told him her husband, Alistair Finch, was a wealthy railroad contractor, a man with friends in Cheyenne, a man who owned judges and marshals. To the world, he was a builder of the New West. In private, he was a brute. She spoke of the years of hiding bruises beneath silk, of his chilling, quiet rages, and she told him of the last night. "He was drunk," she said, her voice hollow, her eyes fixed on the fire. "He was angry about a contract, said he'd been cheated. He went to Jesse's room. He said the boy was weak, that I was making him weak." Her breath hitched, the memory threatening to choke her. "Jesse was crying. Alistair was holding him, shaking him. I tried to stop him. I begged him. He threw Jesse. The boy hit the wall." She stopped, the silence in the cabin absolute. "Then he turned on me." Her hand went to her throat, to the faint, yellowing marks that were all that remained of his fingerprints. "He said he would finish it, for both of us. He was squeezing. I couldn't breathe. I reached for the fireplace poker. I just wanted him to stop. I just wanted him to let go." She looked up at Eli, her eyes wide, desperate for him to understand. "He fell. He didn't get up. There was so much blood. Eli, it wasn't murder. He was going to kill us. He was going to kill my son." She told him how she had grabbed the sleeping, dazed Jesse, taken the small amount of household money she had, and fled into the night. She had sent Jesse with her former governess, a woman she trusted, south to a small farm in Kansas. She had given them every dollar she had. Charlotte was supposed to follow, to meet them when the trails were clear. But Alistair's brother, a man cut from the same cruel cloth, had put a price on her head. The men on the stagecoach, they were not lawmen, they were bounty hunters. When she finished, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the ragged rasp of her own breathing. She was shaking, braced for his judgment. She expected disbelief. She expected the cold pity she despised. Eli just watched her. His face, carved from the shadows, had not changed. He had listened to her whole, ugly story without moving a muscle. He set the knife and stone aside. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I believe you," he said. The 2 words were simple. They were flat. They were absolute. He did not offer pity. He did not offer empty comforts. He offered her belief. It was the one thing she needed, the one thing she had not had since she had fled. She shattered. The breath she had been holding for months, for years, tore out of her in a sob. It was not a cry of fear. It was a cry of profound, agonizing gratitude. She bent forward, hiding her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. He moved. He crossed the small space in one stride and knelt before her chair. He did not pull her into an embrace, did not try to stop the tears. He simply rested his large, calloused hands on her knees, grounding her. He waited until the worst of the storm passed. When her sobs quieted to small, hitching breaths, he reached up. His hand was rough, scarred from work and from wounds she could not guess. He touched her face, his thumb brushing the dampness from her cheek. His touch was impossibly gentle for a man so hard. "You stop crying now," he murmured. He leaned in and pressed his lips to her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a seal, a promise, a benediction. He had claimed his side. The bounty hunter arrived 2 days later. The world had turned to mud. The heavy snow, saturated by the warmer air, was collapsing. The sound of the horse was a wet, sucking squelch, a sound of grim progress. Eli was outside, splitting the last of the dry wood. He went still, his axe buried in the chopping block. He looked at the cabin door, his eyes flat and cold. "Inside," he said, his voice low. "Pantry, take the revolver. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs. She did not question him. She ran inside, grabbed the gun from the table, and scrambled into the small, dark space, pulling the curtain shut, leaving only a tiny gap. A man on a tired-looking Pinto stopped 20 yards from the cabin. He was a large man, with a greasy, tobacco-stained beard, and he wore a long, filth-caked duster. He was not a marshal. "Eli McKenna," the man called, his voice oily and familiar. "Been a long time, you damn hermit." Eli did not move from the chopping block. "Not long enough. Dawson." "Always a pleasure." Dawson smirked. He had a cigarillo clenched in his teeth. He unrolled a paper he had kept dry inside his coat. "I'm looking for a piece of property. Answers to the name Charlotte Finch. High-strung. Dangerous. Worth $500. Dead or alive." Eli rested his hands on the axe handle. "Never heard of her." Dawson laughed, a wet, hacking sound. His gaze scanned the area. It landed on the mud near the cabin door. He saw the small, faint footprints, half washed away, that did not match Eli's heavy boot tracks. His smirk widened into a grin. "You always were a bad liar. McKenna, looks like you got company. Now, you can hand her over, and I'll cut you in for 100, or I can take her and take you for aiding a fugitive." Dawson's hand drifted, settling on the grip of his pistol. "I'll take the woman. She don't have to be alive." "She's not here," Eli said, his voice a low, warning rumble. "I think she is." Dawson drew. He was fast, but he was not fast enough. He was not even close. Eli had not moved, but the pistol that lived on his hip was suddenly in his hand. Before Dawson's gun had even cleared the leather, Eli's was level. A single shot exploded, the sound flat and final in the damp air. Charlotte screamed, clamping her hand over her mouth. Dawson looked down at his chest, a dark, flowering stain spreading across his duster. His expression was one of pure, blank surprise. He toppled from his horse and hit the mud with a heavy, wet sound. The silence that followed was absolute. It was broken only by the nervous stamping of the Pinto and the slow drip of water from the eaves. Eli stood, unmoving, the pistol still extended, smoke curling from the barrel. He had not hesitated. He had not warned. He had executed. Charlotte stumbled out of the pantry, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. She stared at the body on the ground, at the spreading blood. Then she looked at Eli. He was a killer, not a defender, not a man pushed to his limit. A killer. The speed of it, the cold efficiency, terrified her. He had just murdered a man in front of his cabin. He looked at her, his face grim, unreadable. He had done it for her. She was shaking. She was horrified. And she was overwhelmed by a wave of gratitude so profound it made her sick. "Help me," Eli said, his voice hoarse. They did not speak. They did not have to. They were bound by this now. They dragged the body. Dawson was heavy, a dead weight that fought them. They took him to a deep ravine where the meltwater was running, a place where the snow was still deep in the shadows. They dug into the soft, thawing earth beneath the drift. It was a grim, silent task. They rolled him in. They covered him with rocks, then packed the snow back over the top. It would not be found until spring, if ever. They walked back to the cabin, covered in mud and something worse. Guilt and survival had become the same thing. That night, the cabin was a fortress, a tomb. The body in the ravine was a dark, shared secret that held them captive. They washed the mud from their hands, from their clothes, but the stain felt permanent. They did not eat. The fire burned low, a single watchful eye in the dark. When it was time, there was no ritual. There was no pretense of top blankets or turned backs. The violence of the day had burned away all boundaries. They stood by the bed, the small space between them electric. He had killed for her. She had buried the dead with him. They were no longer two strangers. They were two accomplices. She moved first. She stepped into his arms, pressing her face against his chest. She was not crying. She was clinging to him, her hands fisted in his shirt, seeking his solidity, his strength, the terrible, protective violence of him. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. But it was not enough. "I don't want to feel afraid anymore," she whispered against his skin. Eli answered her, not with words, but with his hands. He cupped her face, his grip firm, pulling her head back. He looked at her, his gaze intense, possessive, burning away the last of her fear. He was not asking, he was confirming. His kiss was not the slow, desperate kiss of the blizzard. This was something else. It was dark, urgent, and consuming. It was a claim. His hands were rough, sure, moving down her body, unfastening her dress. She was shaking, but not with fear. He lifted her, and she wrapped her legs around his waist as he carried her the single step to the bed. He laid her down, following her, covering her body with his own, a living shield. Their lovemaking was intense. It was slow at first, almost reverent, as his hands rediscovered the lines of a woman's body, and as she learned, for the first time, the feel of a man's touch that was not meant to harm, but to possess in a way that made her feel safe. He kissed the fading bruises on her throat, a silent, angry promise to erase the memory of the man who had put them there. And then the slowness broke. It became reckless, consuming. It was a physical argument against the world, against the law, against the cold. Dead men who haunted them both. This was not just a physical act. For Charlotte, it was the first time in her life she had felt safe. It was the first time she had been truly seen, not as property, but as a person. She was not just wanted, she was chosen. He moved inside her, and she cried out, a sound not of pain, but of a release so profound it felt like a part of her soul was unknotting. She clung to him, meeting his rhythm, taking him in, claiming him as surely as he was claiming her. Afterward, they lay tangled, slick with sweat, the rough wool blankets abrasive against their skin. The fire had burned down to embers, but the cabin was stiflingly warm. She lay with her head on his chest, her ear over his heart, listening to the slow, steady beat. He was running a hand through her hair, a slow, repetitive motion that was almost hypnotic. "My name," she whispered into the darkness, her voice muffled against his skin. His hand stilled. "It isn't Charlotte." She paused, gathering her last bit of courage. Charlotte was the name he liked, the one he called me. She lifted her head, propping herself on an elbow to look down at him in the dying light. He was watching her, his face shadowed, his eyes intent. "My real name is Clara." It was the last secret, the last piece of the woman she had been. Eli looked up at her, at this woman who had survived a crash, the frost, and his own hard nature. He saw the fighter he had trained, the accomplice who had buried a body, and the woman who had just given him back a part of his own humanity. He raised his hand and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Clara," he said. The name was a fact. It was an acceptance. It was a promise. The murder of Dawson set the spring thaw into motion. The air, once sharp and sterile, now smelled of wet earth, pine resin, and decay. The ravine where they had buried the bounty hunter was a running stream of meltwater. They were living on borrowed time, and the loan was coming due. "We leave tomorrow," Eli said, his voice flat. He was cleaning the rifles, all three of them now. His, hers, and the one he'd taken off Dawson. "The mud is bad, but the passes will be clear enough." Clara nodded, her hands busy. She was packing. They had little, but what they had was vital. He had given her a pair of his own wool trousers. They were rough and ridiculously large, but she cut them down and cinched them with a piece of rope. They were warmer than her ruined dress. They packed dried venison, a bag of salt, the small cache of coffee beans he had been hoarding, and all the ammunition. He gave her a pair of his heavy wool socks to wear under her boots. He watched her as she moved, her steps now sure and quiet. She had a purpose that went beyond mere survival. She was a woman on her way to her child. She sat at his rough table, the same table where he'd eaten his solitary meals for years. He had a small, cracked porcelain pot of ink and a single nib pen. She was writing, her brow furrowed in concentration, her tongue caught between her teeth. Her hand, though still red and raw-looking from the frostbite, was steady. She was writing to the family in Kansas, the ones hiding Jesse. She did not write of murder, or snow, or the men they had buried. She wrote of hope. "I am alive. Do not believe what you hear. I am safe, and I am with a good man. I am coming for my son. I do not know when, but the world itself cannot stop me. Keep him safe. Tell him his mother loves him. Tell him I am coming." She folded the simple paper. "How?" "I know a trapper, Silas, over on the Green River," Eli said, not looking up from the gun oil. "He owes me. He'll see it gets to a post office in Utah territory. It'll be slow, but it'll be safe." He took the letter from her, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, against his heart. The gesture was so unconscious, so proprietary that it made her own heart ache. "We need more supplies," he said, standing. "Ammunition, mostly. And coin. I have a cache, from before. It's a risk, but we'll need it for the ride south." He led the way. Eli on his own mare and Clara on the pinto they had taken from Dawson. The world was a mess of sucking mud and running water. They rode for 2 hours, climbing higher into the foothills, away from the cabin, away from the trail to Rawlins. Eli finally stopped at what looked like a total collapse of a hillside, a tangle of old timbers and rockfall. "Old mining shack," he said, dismounting. "The cache is under the floor. Wait here." "I'm coming with you," she said, sliding off the pinto, her own revolver now tucked securely in the rope belt. She had been practicing. He gave her a short, appreciative nod. The shack was a wreck, the roof caved in by a decade of snow, but one corner was still intact. Eli went to the back wall, knelt, and began pulling at the rotten floorboards. Beneath, in a small, oilcloth-wrapped bundle, was his secret. He pulled it out. Canned beans, a heavy box of cartridges, 2 long, dark oilskin dusters, and a small, heavy leather bag that clinked silver dollars. "This'll get us to Kansas," he murmured, his face grim. Clara was stuffing the canned goods into a saddlebag when the voice came. "Well, look what we found. Dawson's horse." Clara froze. Eli's head snapped up. His hand was on his pistol before the words had even settled. 2 men stood in the ruined doorway, their shapes silhouetted against the bright, wet snow. They were not Law. They were the same breed as Dawson, hard-eyed and filth-caked, their coats worn, their guns oiled. "Always knew you were a hoarder." "McKenna," the taller one said, a grin splitting his beard. "We figured Dawson must have found you. When he didn't check in, we came to collect his share, and yours, it seems." Eli shoved Clara back, behind the small, standing remnant of the shack's stone chimney. "Stay down," he hissed. "Hand over the woman. Deserter," the second man said. His voice was higher, nervous. "We'll take her and the 500. Don't have to be like this." "He called you deserter," Clara whispered, her eyes wide. "They know me," Eli said, his voice a low, cold rumble. He was not looking at her. He was watching the men. "They're not here for just you. A last chance. McKenna," the tall one shouted. "Go to hell," Eli replied. The world exploded. Eli fired from the cover of the chimney, the sound of his pistol deafening in the small space. The tall man grunted, hit, but stumbled back into the trees. The second, nervous man panicked, firing 3 wild shots into the shack that splintered the rotten wood. "Circle him," Eli shouted to Clara. "He's going for the trees." He was teaching her, even now. Eli pushed out, firing low, keeping the second man pinned. He ran toward the horses, using them as cover. The tall man was wounded, but he was not out. He was in the timberline, reloading. Clara moved. She did as he said. She clutched her revolver, her heart a wild bird in her chest. She scrambled over the rockfall, out the back of the shack. She was in the open. She saw the second man. He had his gun raised, aimed at where Eli had been. "Point, breathe out, slow." She raised her gun, both hands steady. She did not flinch. She did not close her eyes. She pulled the trigger. The shot was clean. The man spun, his rifle discharging into the mud. He clutched his shoulder, his face a mask of shock. He saw her, and his shock turned to rage. He raised the rifle again. "Clara!" Eli's voice was a warning, but it was too late. The tall, wounded bounty hunter had circled back. He was on Eli's flank. He fired. Eli cried out, a sharp, guttural sound, and stumbled. He went down, clutching his side. The tall man grinned, raising his pistol for the killing shot. "Your time's up, deserter." "No!" Clara screamed. She was still exposed. The man who had taken her shot was fumbling with his rifle. The tall man was focused on Eli. She ran, firing her revolver as she moved. 1 shot, 2, they went wide. But it was enough. The tall man turned, surprised by her attack. That second of distraction was all Eli needed. Lying on his side, his face white with pain, Eli raised his pistol. He fired 1 precise shot. The tall man's head snapped back. He dropped like a stone, his grin of triumph still frozen on his face. The second man, the one Clara had wounded, had seen enough. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his arm, and bolted into the woods, crashing through the brush like a panicked deer. Silence. The smell of sulfur, the drip of water, the heavy, ragged panting of 2 people who had just stepped back from the grave. Clara ran to Eli. He was on his knees, his hand pressed to his left side, just above his hip, dark. Arterial blood was already soaking his coat, staining the snow beneath him. You're a good shot," he panted, his voice thin. He looked at her, his eyes fever bright. "You saved me." "And you, me," she said, her voice shaking. She tore at her shirt, her hands fumbling. "We have to stop the bleeding." He was already fading. The mine, shaft, old assay mine, 1/2 mile, east, dry. She got him on his horse. She did not know how. The journey was a blur of terror, of him slumping in the saddle, of her holding him upright. She found the mine, a dark, cold hole in the rock. But it was dry, as he'd promised. She got him inside, laid him on the oilskin duster, and built a small, smokeless fire deep in the blackness, just as he had taught her. She had the supplies from the shack, the bag of silver, and the ammunition. She left the 2 bodies for the wolves. She spent the night nursing him. The bullet had passed clean through. The miner who had taught her said it was lucky, but he had lost too much blood. The fever set in just after midnight. She tore the last of her old life, her city petticoat into bandages. She cleaned the wound with whiskey from a flask in the cache, her hands steady, her face a mask of concentration. He did not cry out, but his body arched in agony. He was delirious. He spoke of places she did not know. Shiloh, Missouri. He spoke a name, Abigail. She held him, bathing his face with snowmelt, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. He was shivering violently, the shock setting in. She lay down beside him, under the blankets, pressing her own body heat against his, just as he had done for her. He was shirtless, so she could tend the bandages. The firelight played over the landscape of his back, the web of old, white scars. She had to keep him awake. She had to keep him with her. She touched the long, puckered scar on his shoulder. "Who did this to you?" she whispered. His eyes, which had been closed, fluttered open. He was lucid. For a moment, the fever burned in his gaze. "The world," he whispered. She leaned down, her hair falling around her face, and gently, reverently, she kissed the scar. "You're not a monster, Eli," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You've killed, but you're not a monster. You're not like them." He looked away, his jaw tight. A deep, pained sigh rattled his chest. Clara, I am," he coughed, a dry, painful sound. "That man, he knew my name, my real name." He was going to confess. She could feel it, the fever, the darkness, the intimacy of the mine shaft. It was a confessional. "I wasn't always a trapper," he panted, his words labored. I was a captain, Union. We were in Missouri, near the end of the war." His eyes fixed on something in the darkness, a memory she could not see. "My commanding officer, a major, he was a butcher. He saw sympathizers in every shadow. He ordered us to burn a farm. He said the town was hiding guerrillas." Clara watched him, her heart aching. There were women, children, in the house. He ordered them locked in. He said, 'Burn it to the ground. Make an example.'" Eli's hand, cold and trembling, found hers. He gripped it, his knuckles white. "I refused the order. I told my men to stand down. The major, he called me a traitor. He drew his pistol to shoot me." He closed his eyes, the memory finally breaking him. "I shot him first. I killed my commanding officer, in front of my whole company." He fell silent. The fire crackled. "I saved them," he whispered. "The civilians. But I became a murderer, a deserter. I've been running ever since. Eli McKenna, he's a ghost, just like your Charlotte." Clara stared at him, at this powerful, broken man who had just handed her the last broken pieces of his soul. He was a fugitive. He was wanted. He was hiding, just like her. "Then we're the same," she said, her voice firm. She squeezed his hand. "We are both living on borrowed names. We are both living on stolen time. But you are not a monster. You are the man who saved them. And you are the man who saved me." Their bond, forged in snow and blood, now sealed in the shared darkness of their pasts, became unbreakable. The fever broke with the dawn. He was weak, his skin pale and clammy, but his eyes were clear. He would live. They were safe, for a few hours. They sat in the mouth of the mine, the gray morning light illuminating their small, strange world. They shared a tin of cold beans, passing it back and forth. Clara looked out at the wilderness. It was vast, and it was full of men who wanted them dead. "I'm tired of running, Eli," she said, her voice quiet. "I am so tired of being afraid." She looked at him, her gaze so direct, so clear that it took his breath away. "I don't want to be hidden anymore. I want to be chosen." He knew what she was asking. It was not just for his protection. It was for his heart. Eli reached out. His hand was trembling. Not from fever, but from the weight of her words. He took her hand, the one that was not holding the tin. "Then we'll face them," he said, his voice rough, but full of a new, hard certainty. "We'll face them all. We'll get your son. Together." They returned to the cabin. It was a terrible risk. The second man had escaped. He would bring more, but Eli needed to rest. He needed one day of warmth and safety before the long ride south. The cabin felt alien, small, and already part of their past. As Eli lay on the bed, weak but stubborn, Clara went to her satchel, the one he had emptied the first night. He watched her. She dug past the photograph of Jesse. From a false bottom, a slit in the leather lining, she pulled 2 rolled, creased pieces of paper. "Bounty posters." "You had these?" he asked, his voice stunned. "I stole them from the stagecoach," she said, her voice hard. "From the strongbox, after the ambush. I found the key on the driver. I needed to know what I was worth." She unrolled one. It was her face. Charlotte Finch, $500. She looked at the drawing, at the cold, dead eyes of the woman she had been. She looked at Eli, at the man who had just pledged his life to her. "Charlotte is dead," she said. She walked to the hearth. She held the poster, her false face, her false name, to the small, rekindled flame. She watched it catch, blacken, and curl into ash. She did the same with the second one. That night, the air in the cabin was different. It was not the charged silence of survival, or the desperate, urgent heat of their first night. It was quiet. It was tender. Eli was weak, his side tightly bound. Clara helped him settle in the bed, her touch gentle. She blew out the lantern and slipped under the blankets beside him. He turned to her, his movements slow, pained. He looked at her, truly looked at her. In the dim, dying light of the fire, he was not looking at a fugitive or a victim. He was looking at Clara. He kissed her. It was a slow, reverent kiss. It was a kiss of homecoming, of promise. It was more tender than anything she had ever known. This was not the lovemaking of the blizzard, born of loneliness. It was not the lovemaking of the murder, born of urgency. This was a choice. He made love to her slowly, as if it were their last night on earth. And it felt, in the silence of the cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of the men they had killed, that it might be. He kissed the scars on her throat, not to possess, but to heal. She kissed his, the ones on his back, the new one on his side. They were 2 broken, scarred people, making each other whole. Later, she fell asleep in his arms, her head on his good shoulder. The cabin was safe, for this one night. As the fire burned down to its last embers, she stirred, her voice a sleepy, trusting whisper in the dark. "I believe we deserve something good. Eli." He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer. He said nothing, but he held her as if she were the last good thing in the world. They rode south. The world was alive with the sound of running water. The deep, packed snow of the high country gave way to treacherous, sucking mud in the lowlands. The thaw was a betrayal, opening the land not just to them, but to anyone who might follow. Eli was quiet, but it was a different silence than the one he'd kept in his cabin. This was the quiet of a hunter, his senses strained, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines, his wound, healing clean thanks to Clara's care, still pained him. He rode with a stiffness, a constant reminder of their brush with death at the mining shack. Clara rode Dawson's Pinto. She wore the men's trousers and one of the oilskin dusters. Her hair was tucked up under a flat-brimmed hat Eli had found in the cache. She was no longer a city woman, no longer a victim. The revolver he had taught her to use was tucked in a rope belt, the leather worn smooth from her own practice. They avoided towns, skirted ranches, and crossed rivers at night, the icy water soaking them to the bone. They spoke little, but when they did, it was of the future. He likes whittled toys, Clara said one night, her voice soft as they huddled by a smokeless fire of dry aspen. Jesse, he can sit for hours with a small wooden horse. Eli nodded, turning a piece of dried venison over the coals. We'll get him a horse of his own, a real one. He's gentle. Eli, not like his father, he's good. He's yours, Eli said, as if that explained everything. The ride was a blur of shared hardship. They moved with a single purpose, two halves of a whole, bound by the secrets they kept and the future they were chasing. But the world was closing in. To get to Kansas, they had to cross the Union Pacific line. It was an iron spine laid across the territory, a barrier they could not bypass. They came upon a rail checkpoint near a small, wind-blasted settlement called Carbon. It was a cluster of tents and rough-sawn buildings, buzzing with the railway's business. A detachment of 4 soldiers, led by a U.S. Marshal, was stopping all wagon and horse traffic. We go around, Eli said, his voice low, already pulling on his mare's rein. And they see us, Clara countered, her gaze fixed on the checkpoint. We look like we're running. We look like homesteaders. We ride through. He looked at her, saw the hard set of her jaw. She was right. Running was an admission of guilt. He nodded, his hand resting almost casually on his thigh, inches from his gun. They rode forward, their pace steady. 2 more travelers heading south. The marshal, a tall man with a sun-scorched face and cold, pale eyes, watched them approach. He waved them to a halt. Morning, the marshal said, his gaze flicking from Eli's scarred face to Clara's. Just a routine check. We're looking for deserters from the fort and other riffraff. His eyes lingered on Clara. She kept her head down, her hat brim low. Where you folks bound? South, Eli said, his voice a gravelly rumble. Wife's family has a small spread near the Colorado line. The marshal nodded, but his eyes had not left Clara. He had a memory for faces, one that had served him well for 20 years. He had seen the stack of new posters in the Rollins office just last week, delivered by telegraph. He reached into his own saddlebag and pulled one out. It was creased, but the drawing was clear. He held it up. Your wife, he said, his voice flat. She bear a strong resemblance to this woman? Eli's body went rigid. Never seen her, he snarled, his hand dropping to his pistol. Eli, no! Clara's voice was sharp. In a second, the 4 soldiers had their rifles up, the muzzles all trained on Eli. The marshal had not even flinched, his own revolver in his hand, aimed not at Eli, but at Clara. It's over, son, the marshal said. You draw, and she's the first to die. Then you... Eli was frozen, trapped. His gaze was frantic, darting between the rifles, calculating odds he knew he could not beat. He was a dead man. They both were. Clara raised her chin. She looked the marshal square in the eye. He's right, she said, her voice clear and carrying in the cold air. I am not that woman. She reached up and pulled the hat from her head, letting her hair tumble down. That woman's name is Charlotte Finch. My name is Clara, but I am the one you want. Clara! Eli's voice was a roar of disbelief, of betrayal. She ignored him, her eyes locked on the marshal. I will go with you, no trouble, but you will let him go. The marshal's eyebrows rose. That's a fine bargain. Why would I do that? Because he's just a trapper. Clara lied, her voice smooth. He found me in the snow, half dead from a coach wreck. You can see the poster. I was on a stagecoach. He took me in. He didn't know who I was. He's a wanted man himself, a deserter from Fort Laramie. I saw his papers. You take him. You'll have to split the reward with the army. You take me. I'm worth $500. All to you. Let him go, and I'll ride in quiet. No one else has to get hurt. Eli stared at her, stunned by the cold, calculating power of her lies. The marshal considered it. He looked at Eli, whose face was a mask of murderous rage, and then at Clara, who was perfectly calm, perfectly still. He saw the truth of his position. A shootout would be messy. This was clean. "You're a deserter?" the marshal asked Eli. Eli said nothing. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. "He is," Clara said. "Let him run. He's the army's problem. I'm yours." The marshal smiled, a thin, cold expression. "She's a smart one. All right, you." He jabbed a finger at Eli. "Ride. You turn back. You so much as look over your shoulder. My men will put a bullet in your spine. We'll escort you a mile out. Go!" "No," Eli said. He swung his leg over the saddle, dropping to the ground. "I'm not leaving you." "Eli, get on the horse," Clara commanded, her voice breaking. "No, we fight, we run, like we planned, together." He was walking toward her, his hand out. Clara slid off the pinto and met him. She grabbed the front of his duster, pulling him down to her, her face a mask of desperation. The soldiers tensed, but the marshal held up a hand. "Eli, look at me, look!" Her eyes were bright, frantic. "There is no running from this. Not with rifles on us. They'll kill you, then they'll take me. This is the only way." "I won't let you," he growled, his hands coming up to grip her arms. "I won't." "You must," she begged. "I cannot live, knowing I got you killed. And my son cannot grow up thinking his mother was a coward who ran forever. I have to face this, Eli. I am not Charlotte. I am Clara. It's time I answered for her." She pulled his head down and kissed him. It was not the tender kiss of the cabin, or the desperate kiss of the blizzard. It was a kiss of goodbye, hard and fast, and tasting of salt and dust. "Go," she whispered against his lips. "Go live. I will find you again. I swear it." She shoved him back, hard. "Get on your horse." Eli stared at her, his heart breaking. He saw the truth in her eyes. She had made her choice. He was, for the first time in his life, utterly powerless. He turned, his movement stiff, wooden. He climbed onto his mare. One of the soldiers took his rifle. Eli led him. He kept his pistol. The marshal was a man of his word. "Ride him out." The marshal ordered 2 of his men. Clara watched as they escorted him, a prisoner in his own right, to the edge of the settlement. He did not look back. He did not turn his head. He just rode, his back rigid, and disappeared over the rise. Clara's shoulders slumped. The strength that had held her up vanished, leaving her hollow. "All right, Mrs. Finch," the marshal said, his voice void of sympathy. "Let's go to Rollins." The jail cell was a stone box. It was 4 paces long, 2 paces wide. It had a cot, a bucket, and a single, high, barred window that showed her nothing but a patch of gray Wyoming sky. The smell of lye, stale sweat, and human despair clung to the walls. Days passed, or perhaps it was one long gray day that never ended. The jailer brought her thin stew and stale bread, and said nothing. She was a pariah, a murderess. She had lost everything. She had traded her freedom and Eli for a principle. Now, in the cold, crushing silence of the cell, that principle felt thin and foolish. She had no idea where Jesse was, only that he was in Kansas. She had no idea where Eli was, only that he was gone. She began to lose hope. He was a survivor. He was a deserter. He would not risk his own neck. Not really, not for her. He had his own life to live, his own ghosts to flee. He had given her his protection for a time, but she had released him from his promise. He was gone. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing her into the thin, lumpy mattress. On the 5th day, her brother-in-law, Arthur Finch, arrived. He was dressed in a fine black suit, his face a mask of practiced, somber grief. He stood on the other side of the bars, looking at her with cold, dead eyes. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth as oiled steel. "What a tragedy this is. My brother, murdered. His good name, dragged through the mud by your actions." "I didn't kill him, Arthur," she whispered, her voice rusty. "Oh, but you did," he smiled, a small, cruel twitch of his lips. "You were found with his blood on you. You fled with his child, and now you're here. The trial is a formality. I'm afraid, but I wanted to see you. To let you know, I will be there. I will see justice done for Alistair." He was enjoying this. He was the grieving brother, the protector of the family name. But she saw the truth. He was the one who had sent Dawson. He was the one who had fanned the flames. "You," she said, realization dawning. "You wanted this. You wanted me gone." "I wanted my brother's honor protected," he said piously. "The fact that his unfortunate marriage is now concluded is simply God's will. I'll see you at the hanging. Clara." He turned and left. When he was gone, Clara collapsed onto the cot. That was it. Eli was gone. Arthur would see her dead. Her hope, a small, flickering ember, finally went out. The trial began 2 weeks later. The courtroom in Rawlins was packed. It was the biggest spectacle the town had seen in years. Arthur Finch sat in the front row, a pillar of righteous grief. Clara sat at the defendant's table, pale and thin in a borrowed, plain gray dress, her court-appointed lawyer. A young, earnest man named Mr. O'Malley looked terrified. The prosecutor was a bull of a man, hired by Arthur from Cheyenne. He laid out the case with brutal efficiency. The flight, the stolen child, the stagecoach ambush. It painted a picture of a cold, calculating killer. Mr. O'Malley, for all his fear, had a spine. He called his first witness. The defense calls Sarah Goodnight, a small, trembling woman who looked to be in her 50s. Her hands knotted in her apron, took the stand. She was a former maid at the Finch house. "Mrs. Goodnight," O'Malley began, his voice shaking only slightly. "Were you present in the house the night of Alistair Finch's death?" "No, sir," she whispered. Mr. Finch had dismissed me. He was in a rage. "A common occurrence." "Objection!" the prosecutor roared. "Relevance!" "It speaks to the victim's state of mind, Your Honor," O'Malley said, finding his footing. The judge, a stern, older man named Josiah Blackwood, peered over his spectacles. "I'll allow it. For now, answer the question. Mrs. Goodnight." He was a hard man, sir," Sarah whispered, her eyes on her hands. He drank, and when he drank, he hit." The courtroom murmured. Arthur Finch's face was white. "Did you ever see him strike the defendant?" Yes, sir, more than once. She would hide it, with powders. But we all knew. The bruises on her arms. The time he locked her in the pantry for a whole day." The prosecutor was on his feet, but Judge Blackwood silenced him with a look. O'Malley's next witness was a ranch hand, Amos. He testified he'd seen Alistair Finch in a fit of temper over a lost bet, take a crowbar to his own prize stallion's leg, crippling it. Then came the doctor, Dr. Elias Thorne. He was old, respected. He testified that he had, on 3 separate occasions, treated Clara for injuries inconsistent with her explanations. "She claimed she fell down the stairs, Doctor," Thorne said, his voice clear and steady. "But one does not fall down the stairs and receive 3 broken ribs, a black eye, and a split lip. One does not fall, another time, and sprain a wrist so badly the bone is nearly shattered. That is the injury of a woman fending off a blow, Your Honor." The tide was shifting. The whispers in the courtroom were no longer of the cold-blooded murderess, but of the monster she had been married to. Clara watched. A small, fragile seed of hope beginning to sprout in the barren ground of her despair. But it was not enough. The prosecutor, in his closing, was masterful. "Abuse, however terrible, is not a license to murder," he thundered, pacing before the jury. "She did not go to the law. She did not flee to her family. No, she took a poker, and she caved in her husband's skull while he slept. And then she stole his son and ran. That, gentlemen, is not self-defense. That is murder, cold and simple." The jury was out for only an hour. The foreman would not look at her. "Guilty." The word hit Clara like a physical blow. She sagged in her chair. "Mr." O'Malley put a hand on her shoulder, his face stricken. Arthur Finch was smiling, a thin, satisfied smile. "Clara Finch," Judge Blackwood said, his voice heavy with regret. "Will you please rise to receive your sentence?" She stood, her legs shaking, her hands gripping the rail. This was it. This was the end. She had fought, she had run, she had loved, and it had all come to this: a rope. Before this court passes sentence, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom burst open, slamming against the back walls. Everyone turned. A man stood silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. He was gaunt, exhausted, his clothes caked in the mud of a long, hard ride. But his eyes were blazing. It was Eli. "Your Honor," he said, his voice a rough command, "you cannot pass that sentence." The courtroom erupted. The judge hammered his gavel. "Bailiff, restore order. Who are you, sir? This is a court of law." Eli strode forward, parting the crowd. He was not alone. Behind him was an older, distinguished man in a fine Cheyenne suit, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. "My name is Hiram Scott, Your Honor," the older man said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I am an attorney from Cheyenne, and this," he gestured to Eli, "is my client's investigator. We have new evidence, a signed confession." "A confession," the judge said, stunned. "A confession, Mr." Scott repeated. "From the real killer of Alistair Finch, his brother, Arthur Finch." The room exploded. Arthur leapt to his feet, his face purple. "Lies, slander! I'll have you disbarred. This is an outrage." "Is it Mr. Finch?" Hiram Scott asked, his voice cutting through the noise. He pulled a sheaf of papers from his briefcase. "Is it a lie that you owed over $50,000 in gambling debts to the proprietors of the Gilded Cage in Cheyenne? Is it a lie that your creditors were planning to take your land and your life within the week?" Arthur had gone sheet white. "My investigator," Scott said, gesturing to Eli, "is a very persuasive man. He rode to Cheyenne. He found those creditors. He found the man you paid to ambush the stagecoach, to ensure your sister-in-law never made it to trial. And then he found you, and he convinced you that a life in prison was better than being torn apart by the men you owed." He slapped the papers on the judge's bench. "A full confession. Your Honor, Arthur Finch arrived at his brother's home that night to beg for money. He found his brother on the floor, stunned, Clara having already fled. He saw his chance. He smothered his brother with a pillow, finished the job, and then called the marshal, claiming he'd found the body." Clara was staring, her hand over her mouth. She had hit him, she had run, but she had not killed him. Arthur had... Judge Blackwood read the confession, his face growing darker with every line. He looked up, his gaze like iron. "Bailiff, take Mr. Arthur Finch into custody." As the bailiffs dragged the screaming, protesting Arthur from the courtroom, the judge turned to Clara. "Mrs. Finch, it appears this court, and this territory, owes you a profound apology. The verdict is set aside. All charges are dismissed. You are a free woman." Clara did not move. She just stood there, swaying, the world tilting around her. A free woman. The words meant nothing. She was empty, scoured clean by the ordeal. Eli moved to her. He didn't touch her. He just stood in front of her, his presence a shield. He put his hand on her back and guided her, stiff-legged, from the courtroom, from the noise, from the life that had almost ended. He took her out of town. He had his mare, and he had the pinto. He had come for her. He lifted her into the saddle and rode them away from Rawlins, away from the law and the death. He had rented a small, one-room cabin by the river, miles from anyone. It was clean. It was quiet. He led her inside and sat her on a stool by the cold hearth. He knelt, and with the same economical movements she remembered, he built a fire. They sat for an hour, perhaps more. They just watched the flames, listening to the sound of the North Platte flowing past the door. They were both exhausted, scarred, and hollowed out. Finally, she turned to him. Her voice was a dry rasp. "You disappeared," she whispered. I thought you'd gone." He continued to stare into the fire. "You're a deserter. Eli, you rode into Cheyenne. You walked into that courtroom. They could have taken you. They could have hanged you. Why?" She looked at him, her eyes searching his hard profile. "Why did you come back?" Eli turned his head. He looked at her, his gaze holding all the miles he had ridden, all the risks he had taken. "Because I was never leaving," he said, his voice rough. "Not again. I left someone once. I buried her. I'm not burying anyone else." Clara's breath hitched. She didn't need to say anything. She slid from the stool and knelt on the rough floorboards beside him. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't move for a moment. Then, slowly, his arm came up. He pulled a heavy wool blanket from the nearby cot and wrapped it around them both. He pulled her close. There was no heat but their own, and the fire. The intimacy was not the fire of their past, not the desperate heat of survival or the urgency of fear. It was the slow, deep, and steady warmth of embers that had been scattered and were now gathered back together. It was slower, gentler. It was the homecoming of a body and a heart that had been given up for lost. He held her, and she held him back. And in the small cabin by the river, they were finally, truly, safe. The journey to Kansas was a reverse of the one that had almost killed her. They left the high, cold rock of Wyoming and descended into the great, rolling grasslands of the plains. The spring thaw had turned the trails to mud, but with every league south, the air grew warmer, the ground firmer. They rode for weeks, speaking little, existing in the quiet, shared space of their new, fragile freedom. Eli's wound healed, leaving another pale scar on his side, a companion to the map of his past. He had walked out of that courtroom in Rawlins, a wanted deserter, and had not looked back. He had gambled his own freedom on her, and in doing so, had found a different kind of liberation. He was no longer running. He was moving toward something. Clara, too, was changed. The gaunt, terrified woman who had stumbled into his cabin was gone. This woman was thin, yes, but sinewy, hardened by the ride, by the trial, by the simple, constant act of survival. Her eyes, no longer wide with fear, were clear and steady. She had faced down her past, and she had a future to claim. They arrived in Kansas in the late summer, the air thick and heavy with the smell of sun-baked dust and ripening corn. The land was flat, an endless green-gold ocean under a sky so vast it humbled them both. They found the farm, a small, neat homestead with a sod-roofed cabin and a field of tall corn, just as the letter had described. Clara dismounted before the pinto had fully stopped. Her heart was a hammer, beating so hard she thought it might break her ribs. This was the final trial, a verdict more terrifying than any a judge could deliver. A woman, older, with kind eyes and work-worn hands, came out onto the small porch, wiping her hands on an apron. It was Mrs. Albright, her former governess, the only woman she had ever trusted. The woman's eyes widened, and then filled with tears. "Clara," she breathed, her voice a mix of disbelief and prayer. "Dear child, we heard you were, they said
I'm here,
Clara said, her voice trembling.
I'm safe. Where is he?
Mrs. Albright just pointed, her gaze moving to the side of the cabin. A small boy, blonde-haired and sturdy, was crouched in the dirt, entirely focused on a small wooden soldier in his hand. Clara's breath caught. It was Jesse. He was taller. He was not a baby anymore. He was a boy. He looked up, his expression curious, wary. He saw the two strangers, the horses, his governess crying on the porch. He did not recognize the woman in the strange men's trousers, her face thin and brown from the sun. He stood and, with a child's pure instinct, took 2 steps back, hiding half behind a rain barrel. The rejection was a physical blow. Clara felt her knees buckle. She had fought bounty hunters, survived a blizzard, faced a hanging judge. All for this, and her own son looked at her as if she were a ghost. Eli had stayed back, holding the reins of both horses, his face a mask of careful neutrality. He knew this was not his ground. He was a sentinel, nothing more. Clara took a step forward, her hands raised, palms open, as if approaching a frightened colt.
Jesse,
she said, her voice cracking, completely unfamiliar to her own ears. The boy just stared, his thumb finding its way to his mouth.
Jesse, it's Mama.
She could not breathe. She sank to her knees in the dusty yard, the distance of 10 feet feeling like 1,000 miles. I'm here. I told you I would come. I'm here, my love. She held out her hands, the hands that were scarred from frostbite, calloused from rope and triggers. They were not the soft, pale hands he would have remembered. He tilted his head. He looked at her hair, at her strange clothes. He saw the tears that were now streaming openly down her face, cutting clean paths through the trail dust. He looked from her to Mrs. Albright and back. Clara could not bear it. She broke. She covered her face, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. It was the one wound she could not survive. A small sound made her look up. He had taken one hesitant step, then another. He was studying her, his brow furrowed, as if trying to solve a puzzle. He saw her, not as the woman he remembered, but as a woman in profound, animal pain. "Mama?" he whispered, the word a question. That was all. He ran. His small, bare feet pounded the dust. He launched himself into her arms, slamming into her chest with a force that knocked her backward. His arms locked around her neck, his face buried in her hair, and he began to cry, not with fear, but with the dam burst of a long-held, childish grief. Clara enveloped him, her arms crushing him to her. She held the back of his head, her face pressed against his, their tears mixing. She said his name, over and over, a prayer, a litany, a promise kept.
Jesse, 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 I'm here, I'm safe, I'm never leaving you, never again.
From his place by the horses, Eli watched. He had stood firm against gunfire, against his own commanding officer, against a marshal's rifle. But this, the sound of the woman he loved weeping with joy, the small, clinging arms of the child he had never met, it overwhelmed him. He turned his back to them, pretending to check the Pinto's cinch, and roughly wiped a tear from his own eye with the back of his dusty glove. That evening, they sat at Mrs. Albright's small table. Jesse, who had not left Clara's side, sat on her lap, his small hand possessively gripping the fabric of her shirt. He was quiet, just watching the tall, scarred man who sat across from them. Eli was as silent as the boy. He ate the broth and bread he was given, his gaze lingering on the child, then on Clara. He was an outsider here, a ghost from her other life. Jesse, his fear finally gone, turned his full, curious gaze on the man. He pointed a small, grubby finger. "Mama," he said, his voice clear. "Is he my new PA?" The air in the cabin went perfectly still. Clara's breath hitched. She looked at Eli. her eyes wide, vulnerable, asking a question she had not dared to voice. Eli met her gaze. He looked at the boy on her lap, and at her, the woman who had saved him in as many ways as he had saved her. His face, usually so hard and unreadable, softened. He thought of the empty, silent cabin in Wyoming. He thought of the long, cold years. Clara saw the decision in his eyes. She smiled, a slow, watery smile, and turned back to her son.
"If he'll have us, Jesse,"
she whispered, her hand finding Eli's on the table. "If he'll have us." Eli did not speak. He just turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. It was all the answer she needed. They did not stay. Mrs. Albright, her duty done, was returning east to her own family, and Eli knew that Arthur Finch's associates, the men he owed money to in Cheyenne, would not forget. A woman who had cost them $50,000 was still a target. They took the silver dollars Eli had saved, and the reward money the territory had, in its shame, granted Clara for her wrongful imprisonment. They traveled south to the Arkansas River, to a place where the land was unclaimed, where no one knew the names Finch or McKenna. They built their life from the ground up. Eli, who had known only how to survive, learned how to build. He felled cottonwoods by the river, and together they raised a small, sturdy cabin. It was not the cramped, dark fortress in the mountains. This cabin had 2 windows. He was gone for a week. Just as they were finishing the roof, he rode out one morning with the pack mare, and Clara was consumed by the old, familiar terror. He was a deserter. He was a wanderer. She thought he had left, that the burden of a wife and son was too much. He returned with a wagon. He had ridden all the way to the nearest freight office on the Santa Fe line. He had supplies, flour, seed corn, an iron stove, and a crate of glass for the windows. And, wrapped in canvas in the back of the wagon, was a bundle of rough-hewn pine slats, worn rope, and 2 wooden side rails. Clara stared at it, uncomprehending.
"What is this?"
she asked. Eli looked almost embarrassed. He pulled a piece of wood from the wagon. "I went back," he said gruffly, not meeting her eyes. "To Wyoming."
You went back?"
she whispered, horrified.
"The risk, Eli, they could have—"
"It saved your life," he said, cutting her off. He dropped the piece on the ground. "It was ours. I wasn't leaving it for someone else to burn." That night, they assembled it. The same bed. The simple, rough rope cot that had held them, chaste and terrified. That first night, the bed where he had held her through her nightmares. The bed where she had given him her real name. They set it in the corner of their new home. They bought a new, thick mattress, stuffed with fresh ticking. But the frame, the heart of it, was the same. Life settled into a new rhythm, one defined not by the gunshot, but by the sunrise. They planted crops. They raised Jesse. Eli, the solitary recluse, found himself teaching a small, laughing boy how to bait a hook, how to whittle a piece of soft wood into a bird. Clara, the runaway, found herself singing as she hung laundry, her hands buried in garden soil. But peace, for those who have only known war, is a fragile thing. Some nights, Clara would wake with a start, her body rigid, her heart pounding. The darkness of the cabin would twist, becoming the freezing, suffocating dark of the Wyoming blizzard, or the damp, stone-cold dread of the Rawlins jail cell. She would gasp, her hand flying to her throat, expecting to find Alistair's fingers. And Eli would be there. He would be awake before she was, his hand already on her back, anchoring her to the present. "You're here," he would whisper, his voice a low rumble in the dark. She would be shaking, crying silently. He would pull her back against his chest, his arms a solid wall. "It's just the wind. Clara, just the wind on the prairie. You're safe. I'm here. You're safe." She would slowly, come back. She would match her breathing to his steady heartbeat a reminder that she was not alone. She was not a prisoner. She was home. The seasons turned. The blazing Kansas summer gave way to a sharp, clear autumn. The corn was harvested, the cabin chinked and ready. And then, one night, the first snow of the season began to fall. It was not the driving, violent snow of the mountains. It was a gentle, quiet fall, the flakes drifting past the new glass windows. Jesse was asleep in his own small trundle bed, his face peaceful in the firelight. Eli sat by the hearth, mending a piece of harness, the picture of a settled homesteader. Clara watched him. The firelight played on his scarred hands, on the rough, kind lines of his face. The cabin was warm, secure. The cold nipped at the air, a reminder of what winter meant. But this time, it was different. She went to him. He looked up as she knelt before him. She took the leather harness from his hands and set it aside. She took his large, calloused hands in her own. He saw the look in her eyes. It was not the desperate need of the blizzard. It was not the fierce, urgent claiming after Dawson's death. It was not the gentle, healing reunion after the trial. This was something new. It was a look of pure, quiet joy. She was offering him her body, just as she had that first night, but not to survive the cold. This time, it was to celebrate the warmth they had built, the life they had forged with their own scarred hands. He stood, pulling her to her feet. He led her to the bed, their bed. Their final love scene was a quiet symphony. It was filled with the whispered promises of a future, the promises of forever that both had thought long dead. There were silent tears, not of sorrow or fear, but of a gratitude so profound it had no words, a final surrender, not to each other, but to the peace they had earned. Later, they lay tangled together, the wool blankets pulled high. The fire had burned down to a red, breathing glow. Outside, the snow was falling, blanketing the prairie, making the world clean and new. Clara lay with her head on his chest, watching the flakes drift past the window. "I ran to stay alive," she whispered, her voice soft in the quiet room. "But with you, I lived." Eli tightened his arm around her, pulling her so close they shared the same breath. He kissed the top of her head. He, too, looked at the falling snow. No longer an enemy, no longer a prison. It was just weather. "You're not hiding anymore, Clara," he answered, his voice a rough, final vow. "You're home." Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment. Make sure to subscribe to From Wild West and let us know your thoughts on the story in English.